Shortly before graduating from high school, my buddies and I decided to have one last hurrah. We chose to explore the old abandoned sanatorium on the outskirts of town, a place rumored to be haunted or, at the very least, incredibly eerie. The sanatorium had been shut down decades ago, left to decay with stories of experimental treatments and lost souls. Armed with nothing but our flashlights, a sense of adventure, and naivety, we ventured inside. The building was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each more dilapidated than the last. But it was when we descended into the lower levels that things took a turn for the peculiar. The air grew thick and heavy with a musty smell that wasn't just old wood or mold, it was earthier, like wet soil after a rain. We entered what seemed to be an old treatment area, where the floors were no longer tiles or concrete, but a squelching muck. The walls wept with moisture, and the rooms were filled with a strange, viscous mud. It wasn't just mud though, it had an unsettling warmth to it, like it was alive or had been recently disturbed. Ignoring our growing unease, we pressed on, joking about discovering some secret underground swamp. But then, in one room, Mark, who was always the bravest of us, stepped into a particularly deep patch of mud. His legs sank quickly, up to the knee, and when he tried to pull it out, the mud gripped him with an unnatural resistance. Panicking, we helped him out, but not before noticing small, bone-like fragments within the mud. They weren't large enough to be human, we told ourselves, but perhaps they were animal bones. However, none of us were exactly convinced. The further we explored, the more the rooms became less like hospital wards and more like something from a nightmare. In one room, the mud formed patterns on the walls, spirals and shapes that seemed too deliberate to be random. In another, we found old, rusted medical tools half buried, as if the mud was trying to swallow them, or perhaps had regurgitated them. Then came the room where the mud wasn't just mud. It moved, subtly, as if breathing. Here is where Jake slipped, and when he tried to stand, his hands pressed against something soft yet firm beneath the surface. When he pulled them back, they were stained not just with mud, but with something that looked disturbingly like old, congealed blood. The air grew colder, the atmosphere denser, and our flashlights began to flicker. That's when we heard it, a low, gurgling sound, not from any throat, but as if the very room was trying to speak, or to scream. We ran, our feet squelching through the mud, each step feeling like the ground was trying to suck us in. When we finally made it out, panting and covered in that vile mud, we didn't speak of what we saw or felt. The sanatorium stood silently behind us, as if watching us leave, its secrets submerged in its muddy depths. We graduated and went our separate ways, but none of us ever forgot that night. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still feel the warm, sticky pull of that living mud, a reminder that some places are abandoned for a reason, and some places are left alone because they are not quite of this world anymore. My friend Stephanie and I were in the 5th grade when liminal spaces began to become popular on the internet. Photos of empty malls, deserted playgrounds at dusk, and endless hallways that seemed to belong to no particular place captured our imagination. They felt eerie yet oddly comforting, like stepping into a dream where time stood still. One lazy Saturday, Stephanie came over with a wild idea. "There's this old, abandoned school on the edge of town," she whispered, even though we were alone in my room. "It's gotta be full of liminal spaces. Let's go check it out." Curiosity got the better of us, and we rode our bikes to the outskirts, where the buildings thinned out and nature began to reclaim the land. The school is indeed abandoned, with windows like hollow eyes and doors slightly ajar, beckoning us into its forgotten embrace. We ventured inside, our footsteps echoing in the desolate hallways. The air was musty, with a scent of decay and old books. Each classroom we peeked into was a snapshot of sudden abandonment. Chairs were scattered, some lessons still written on the chalkboards. Then we found the staircase leading to the basement. Unlike the rest of the school, which felt merely neglected, the basement had an oppressive atmosphere. Stephanie hesitated, but I, ever the adventurer, led the way down. The light from our phones barely cut through the gloom. The first few rooms were typical storage, old gym mats, broken desks, but then we opened a door to something entirely different. Inside, the floor was covered in a thick layer of mud, wet and glistening under our lights. The walls were damp, with water trickling down in places, creating an unsettling symphony of drips. "What is this place?" Stephanie's voice trembled. Before I could answer, we heard it, a soft, squelching sound, like footsteps in the mud, but we saw no one. Looking back, we should have run right then and there, but the mudroom held a bizarre allure. We stepped in, the mud sucking at our shoes, making every step an effort. As we ventured further, we found more rooms, each with variations of mud. Some were drier, crackling like a desert, while others were almost liquid. The squelching sounds grew louder and closer, yet whatever made them was always out of sight. Then, in one room, the mud wasn't just on the floor. It began to ooze from the walls, forming shapes, faces, half-formed figures that seemed to watch us. The air grew colder, and a whisper filled the room, indistinguishable but unmistakably there. Stephanie grabbed my arm. "We need to leave now." We turned to run, but the door we came through was now just another mud-covered wall. Panic set in. The mud was rising, now to our ankles, and the figures in the walls started to reach out with muddy appendages. We scrambled back through room after room, each one more disorienting than the last, the layout no longer making sense, as if the rooms themselves were shifting. Finally, gasping for breath, we found a set of stairs leading up, different from the ones we descended. We burst out into the evening air, not in the school but in a field miles away from where we started, our bikes nowhere in sight. We were covered in mud and shivering, and we made our way home, swearing never to speak of what happened. Years passed, and we never did return or discuss what happened that day. But sometimes, I'll find a bit of mud in my shoes, long after it should have been possible, and I wonder if we truly left those liminal rooms behind. Or maybe, just maybe, a part of them lingers with us, waiting in the spaces where reality thins. Back in high school, I managed to score a date with this really hot girl named Mary. In hindsight, I'd say she was definitely a bit odd, and kind of a neat freak. Among the many things she didn't like, she absolutely hated getting muddy. So naturally, when she suggested we explore this old abandoned building on the outskirts of town for our date, I was puzzled, but too thrilled to question it. The building was known to locals as the Warren because once you entered, it felt like you were in an endless maze of rooms and corridors, each eerily similar yet subtly different. The rumor was that it was once a sanatorium, but no one really knew for sure. On the night of our date, the air was thick with an impending storm, making the atmosphere even more foreboding. Mary led the way with an odd gleam in her eye, flashlight in hand. We stepped into the Warren, and immediately the sound of dripping water and the musty smell of decay enveloped us. As we ventured deeper, the floors began to change. What started as dusty concrete soon turned into patches of soft, wet earth. Then, room after room, the ground became increasingly covered in mud. Some rooms had inches of it, with footprints that looked disturbingly fresh, as if someone, or something, had just walked through before us. Mary seemed unfazed by the mud, which was out of character, but her excitement grew with each room we entered. She would comment on the texture, the coldness, how it squelched underfoot. I was getting uneasy. The mud seemed to pull at my shoes, making each step heavier. Then, in one particularly large room, the mud was up to our ankles. Here Mary stopped, her face pale in the flashlight's beam. She whispered something about this being her favorite room. That's when I noticed shapes moving within the mud, like serpents just below the surface, or maybe roots, but there were no plants around. I suggested we should leave, but Mary grabbed my arm with a strength I didn't expect. "We can't leave yet," she insisted, her voice trembling not with fear but with anticipation. She explained, in a rush of words, that she believed this place was a threshold, a liminal space where the earth reclaims what's been taken from it, and she wanted to witness it, to be a part of it. Just then, the mud began to bubble slightly, and I felt something wrap around my ankle. Panic set in. I tried to pull away, but Mary's grip was iron. "It's just the process," she said, almost trance-like. "You'll see. It's beautiful." I yanked my leg free from whatever was holding it, losing my shoe in the process, and ran, dragging Mary with me. She resisted at first, but then ran too, though reluctantly. We didn't stop until we burst out into the night air, mud-soaked and breathless. After that night, Mary wouldn't talk about what happened. She acted like nothing was amiss, but there was a distant look in her eyes whenever we passed by mud or even wet soil. I never went back to the Warren, and I heard later that it was demolished for safety concerns. Yet, sometimes, I still feel a tug in my ankle in my dreams, where the mud of those endless rooms tries to pull me back into its cold, embracing darkness, and where Mary, or whatever she had become in that moment, waits patiently for my return. I never really considered myself much of a gamer. Sure, I dabble in some mobile games or play a few rounds of whatever was popular at the time with friends, but I never really got hooked on anything. That was, until I stumbled upon an obscure forum post about a game called Echoes of the Lost. The description was vague: explore the endless, find what's lost. Intrigued by the mystery, I downloaded it, not knowing how it would change my perception of reality. The game started typically enough. I was in an old, dusty room with peeling wallpaper and a single flickering light bulb. The graphics were astoundingly realistic, thanks to, as I later learned, the power of the NVIDIA RTX 4080 Super, which was rumored to render environments indistinguishable from reality. As I navigated through the game, the rooms began to shift. Corridors stretched endlessly, doors led to unexpected places, and soon I found rooms filled with mud. Not just any mud, but a thick, viscous substance that seemed almost alive, slowly oozing across the floor, walls, and ceilings. The realism was uncanny. I could almost smell the damp earthiness. I kept playing, driven by an eerie compulsion. Each room was different, but shared the theme of decay and mud. Some had furniture half submerged in muck, others had mud dripping from the ceiling, forming stalactites of sludge. The sound design was chilling. Every squelch and drip echoed in a way that made my skin crawl. Then things got weirder. In one particularly large room, where the mud rose like small hills, I noticed something shimmering at the center. Approaching it, the mud seemed to pulse, as if breathing. I reached out in the game, and to my horror, my virtual hand came back with mud that felt wet, even through the screen. I began to panic and try to exit the game, but it wouldn't close. Instead, a message popped up. You found the heart. Are you ready to see beyond? The game then shifted into what I can only describe as a hyper-realistic simulation. The mud rooms were no longer just rooms. They were part of a vast, interconnected liminal space, an endless maze designed to trap or perhaps test its players. Each turn, each door I opened now felt like stepping into another layer of reality. The more I explored, the more I understood that this wasn't just a game. It was a simulation so advanced, powered by the RTX 4080 Super, that it blurred the lines between digital and physical. The mud, I realized, was a metaphor, or maybe even a literal substance from another dimension, seeping through the cracks of our reality, facilitated by the simulation. Eventually I encountered others, or at least what I thought were other players. They were stuck in their own loops, some resigned, some mad, all covered in the virtual mud which seemed to bind them to this place. They spoke of the simulation as if it were alive, learning from each player and evolving. In case you're wondering, I'm still here, navigating these endless muddy corridors, looking for an exit, or perhaps a deeper truth. This simulation has become my reality, or perhaps it always was, and what I thought was real was merely the game. Each day, the mud feels more real, more alive, and I wonder if one day I'll be able to feel it on my actual skin, or worse, if I already do. I don't want to sound old, but I think it's a shame not many people played Minecraft back when it was in beta. There was just something raw and thrilling about the endless possibilities of a world not yet fully understood, where every block placed was an act of discovery. But this story isn't about Minecraft. It's about what happened after I thought I'd seen all the game could offer. It was late one night, and I was exploring an old server that had been abandoned since the beta days. The server was a literal time capsule, with structures from a decade ago frozen in digital amber. That's when I stumbled upon a peculiar structure, something that didn't quite fit with the usual blocky aesthetic. It was a doorway, oddly out of place, leading to what looked like a natural cave rather than one mined out by a player. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked through. The game glitched for a moment, and the screen flickered as if resisting what was to come. On the other side was no cave, but a hallway. Not made of blocks, but of old, peeling wallpaper, dim lights, and a musty smell that somehow, creepily, I could almost sense through my screen. This wasn't Minecraft anymore. It was like I had phased into a liminal space, a place that felt stuck between realities. The hallway had doors on either side. Each one I opened revealed a room, and in every room there was mud. But not just regular mud, it was as if the mud itself was alive, slowly oozing, shifting ever so slightly with occasional bubbles that would pop with a wet gurgling sound. The first room was unsettling, the second eerie, but by the third, a cold dread had settled deep in my stomach. The mud in these rooms, it had patterns, like it was trying to form something or maybe remember something. Then in the fourth room, the mud began to rise, taking shape. It was forming into figures, not quite human, but close enough to make me recoil. They had hollows where eyes should be, and they whispered in a language that sounded like the crackle of dead leaves. I tried to exit the game, but my computer wouldn't respond. The figures spoke of being forgotten, of worlds left behind in the digital dust, seeking form, seeking remembrance. Panicking, I unplugged my computer, hoping to sever whatever connection had been made. When I restarted, everything seemed normal, back in the blocky world of Minecraft. But there was a new texture pack installed, unrequested, named Remembrance. Everything now had a slight muddy texture to it, and at times, I swear the blocks would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I've stopped playing Minecraft since then, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that same wet, gurgling sound from somewhere within my computer. It's like something is still trying to take form and to be remembered. And every so often, in the corner of my room where the shadows gather, I see the faintest outline of figures, not quite there. It's as if they're waiting for someone to play once more in their forgotten world.